Professor Alan Dershowitz is one of the foremost legal experts in the world. He says cases 2000 and 4000 are a danger to democracy, a danger to the balance between freedom of the press and the police, between relations of the government to journalists. He says there is no precedent in history. There is no precedent in the history of Israeli law. And he also says worldwide that positive media coverage is a crime.
We are back on the Spin Room, and that was the Israeli Prime Minister enlisting renowned Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz in his rebuttal speech last week after the Attorney General published his accusations against him. And I'm very happy to welcome back to the Spin Room Professor Alan Dershowitz himself, joining us from Martha's Vineyard. And here in studio is former Israeli Deputy State Prosecutor Yehudashaffer. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today on the Spin Room. Professor Dershowitz, I want to start with you. In an open letter that you wrote to the Israeli Attorney General, you wrote last week in an attempt to dissuade him from publishing his recommendations that, to quote, to bring down a duly elected prime minister on the basis of an expansive and unprecedented application of a broad and expandable criminal statute endangers democracy. So before we drill down into the cases themselves, when you use the words bring down an elected prime minister, are you implying that the Attorney General himself is part of an effort to end the Prime Minister's rule?
Absolutely not. I have the greatest respect for the Attorney General. I've known him for many years. He is nonpartisan. He has no interest in bringing down any Prime Minister. His interest is in applying the law. My open letter was an effort to try to persuade him, as somebody who loves Israel and respects the Israeli legal system, that the 2,000 and 4,000 cases really do pose a danger to the relationship, the vibrant relationship between the media and elected public officials. My concern is that if you start investigating every public official who seeks positive press coverage or ends negative press coverage, you will have investigation after investigation. For example, in the Yehudashaffer case, more than 40 members of the Knesset voted in favor of this law, which would have been a terrible law. I was strongly opposed to it. The Prime Minister ultimately was against it, and many of the people who voted for it got good coverage as the result from Yehudashaffer. They may not have sat down and made a deal about it, but politicians think about good coverage all the time. And to have prosecutors start intruding into the delicate relationship between the media and government, I think does pose a problem for freedom of the press as well as for the freedom of politicians to operate within the law. If you want to pass a statute that says that you can't seek good coverage in exchange for how you vote, let them put that in front of the Knesset. You know how many votes they get in the Knesset for such a law? Zero, because every member of the Knesset would be worried that they would be the next person being investigated, and you shouldn't be prosecuting somebody unless you could get the Knesset to pass a law making what they've done illegal, and that would not be possible here.
I want to bring in Yehudashaffer into the discussion, a former deputy state prosecutor. Can you address the professor's claim, what he just said, and about this is an unprecedented application of a broad and expandable criminal statute?
Well, first of course, I respect Professor Dershowitz's opinion. I used to go and listen to his classes when I was at Harvard.
When you were at Harvard, okay.
Yes, and I see his concern. But first of all, in the Israeli context, because the words bringing down the prime minister were used, I just want to put into context. In Israel, the prime minister is not directly elected by the public, and therefore there's no impeachment procedures. The government falls when it loses the vote of the Knesset. In this case, even if the indictment goes through next year, the Knesset will have to decide. Some members of coalition have already implied that if the indictment is severe, they will not support the Prime Minister. If they support him, the Prime Minister will not fall. So at the end of the day, Israel is a democracy, and the Knesset is the one that decides who will be Prime Minister. With regard to the point made about positive media coverage, I am not the Attorney General spokesman. I don't work there anymore, but I read the draft indictment. I see it a little differently. I think we're not talking about normal press relation, politician-press relations, and if it was so, I would definitely agree with Professor Dershowitz. Nothing here is nuanced or delicate. We're talking about a relationship here where it was quid pro quo. It was asking for a positive media coverage for himself and negative media coverage for others. in exchange for providing, at least in case 4000, in exchange for providing actual benefits, regulatory benefits worth hundreds of millions of shekels.
I want to ask Professor Dershowitz exactly about case 4000. You know, that's the one where the Prime Minister allegedly pushed for regulatory benefits worth hundreds of millions of dollars for Shaul Elovitch, the owner of Bezek Telecom company, in exchange for favorable news coverage on his website, Walla. Professor, that case is seen as more serious by the Attorney General. It's the only one where the Prime Minister could be indicted for bribery. So what has the Attorney General gotten wrong here, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, it is more serious. I think the 2000 case is a much more dangerous one for democracy. And I think if the Attorney General had limited himself and only indicted on 4000, he'd be on much, much stronger ground. But when he also indicts on 2000, it puts 4000 into a different context. It basically says, we have a broad criminal statute. It's not in the statute. It's just being interpreted. That does allow the concept of bribery to be based on positive coverage. And that's just unprecedented in democracies around the world. And it poses an enormous, enormous danger. If they had said, look, in exchange for major benefits, he did something that would put money directly in his pocket, that would be one thing. But I just worry about the expansive nature of 2000. And when you look at 4000 in the context of 2000, this is not about Netanyahu. This is about the future of Israeli press and governmental relationships. Because although Israel doesn't have a common law system, precedents do matter. And if you do get indictments based on these kinds of conversation. Remember in 2000, it was the Netanyahu people who recorded the conversation. It seems very likely that this was just an effort to feel out and maybe to make it clear to the world that the owner of Yehudashaffer was willing to bargain away his press integrity for some benefits. So it's so complicated. And when you get issues that are complicated like that, they're not the basis for criminal prosecution. I agree with the former state attorney. This is up to the people. Well, this all should be spread out and let the people vote. And if they decide to vote against this prime minister, that's democracy.
Let's let you
but to have one person, no matter how respectable he is, have this kind of impact before an election is, I think, a danger to democracy.
Okay, Yehuda?
Well, there are other dangers to democracy as well, and these investigations revealed them. And if everything is true there, which is yet to be seen, there's some serious dangers here posed actually by the behavior of Netanyahu. And
let me ask you this, Yehuda, because
the Attorney General, let me just make a point.
Go ahead.
The Attorney General, first of all, was very cautious and did not accept the recommendation of the State Attorney's Office to indict for bribery for 2000. But because Netanyahu played along during election time with these expectations of Yediot Ahronot and got a positive press coverage in consideration for promoting the law, which in the end did not pass. Because of this, this is a form which is an Israeli law, is breach of trust. But what's really important, and the case 4000 illustrates this, case 4000 was an investigation that began both from the Securities Commission in Israel and from the police. And they met in the middle, because this is a classic a situation of big money meeting politics. These things are no less dangerous to democracy. We see what happened to other democracies in the region, such as Turkey, when the Prime Minister tries to control the press and tries to control the prosecution service. We have our Prime Minister now attacking the prosecution service, which is unprecedented in Israel.
Yeah,
these are real dangers to democracy.
How do you feel, Professor Dershowitz, about the Prime Minister attacking personally the prosecutors themselves, Shai Nitzan and Liad Ben-Ari?
Well, first of all, I think it's open in a democracy to criticize anybody. Anybody can be criticized. And, you know, I once criticized an Italian judge for allowing terrorists to go free. He called them freedom fighters. And I was indicted in Italy for criticizing a judge. Of course, I presented myself in Italy and I said, please try me. I'm dying to be tried for this. They, of course, backed away. Criticism of anybody by anybody is legitimate in a democracy. Again, what I worry about is you say in the middle of an election and he got better coverage. These are matters of degree, and matters of degree should never be the basis for a criminal prosecution. Even going back to 1000, How many cigars is too many? How many bottles of champagne is too many? Pass a law.
When they're worth a few hundred thousand shekels, it becomes too many.
No, then pass a law. I don't want to listen to you about that. I want to see a law that says 100,000 shekels or 50,000 shekels.
Professor,
so somebody can keep himself within the law. That's what should happen. We should have statutes that are clear and precise so that you know when you're crossing the line. That's what's wrong with these indictments.
I totally agree. It's better to have more specific laws. When we presented from the Ministry of Justice a recommendation to clarify the breach of trust crime in Israel, the Knesset rejected it, and we have what we have.
That's the point.
But I think
if they rejected it, then it's not democratic for the Attorney General to overrule the legislature who rejected it.
No, Professor Dershowitz, with all due respect, receiving gifts worth hundreds of thousands of shekels, and on demand of the gift giver, acting on their behalf to get with the American authorities to get an American visa.
Through the Secretary of State, John Kerry, actually called him.
And with the Ministry of
I want to ask the professor before we go.
This is breach of trust.
Professor, before we go, the former ambassador to Israel, Martin Indict, wrote on Twitter last week. He says, "Why is Alan Dershowitz engaged in a blatant attempt to influence the Attorney General of Israel before he even makes any case against Netanyahu? Could he be a Bibi enabler?" What's your response to Martin Indict?
Well, first of all, if you want to influence somebody, you obviously try to do it before, not after. I'm not an enabler of Netanyahu any more than I am of Trump. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in civil liberties for everybody. I'd be making the same argument if this were a member of the Labor Party, if this were a member of any other party. I made the same argument for Hillary Clinton as I did for Donald Trump. Please don't accuse me of partisan motives. My motive is to protect the law, to protect the rule of law, something that Israel is very proud of. People have been attacking me ad hominem. Eric Yaffe, a rabbi who has been attacking me for 30 years in Haaretz today, attacks me, says I'm a tool of Sheldon Adelson. I wrote my article because of Sheldon Adelson. I never spoke to Sheldon Adelson about it. This is all ad hominem, defamatory lies. I'm doing this because I believe strongly in the rule of law. And yes, I did want to have some influence on the Attorney General. I didn't. I failed. I wish I had influence. It would have been better for Israel if he had withheld these two indictments particularly, and certainly not issued them just on the eve of the election. So I'm proud of the role I've tried to play.
Well, I totally disagree. I think the strength of Israel has been proven in the last few decades is the independence of its prosecution service and of its judiciary. This independence allows us to indict and unfortunately convict, in many cases, too many cases, many of our politicians. It's sad on an individual basis, but on the whole picture, it shows that Israel is a place with the rule of law, where the law is applied evenly, and is something which attracts a lot of investment to Israel, improves the economy here, and we shouldn't. There is no way we should restrict this or limit this.
That's why you shouldn't be afraid of criticism. That's why it's very important to have open dialogue and open debate and accept criticism as well.
Thank you very much. Professor Alan Dershowitz, Yehudashaffer, thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's it. I hope you enjoyed watching. Thanks for taking a ride with us on The Spin Room. Hope you hop on again next Monday and Thursday, 4 p.m. in New York, 11 p.m. Tel Aviv. In the meantime,